A bit of a different type of video today because I was recently able to unpack years and years worth of hobby trash. Sorry, I meant rare collectibles. And realise how old I've actually become without even noticing. Some of this stuff is so old it smells like your grandparents' attic. Nothing more so than stupidly old copies of White Dwarf. And it got me thinking, how has this magazine evolved and, well, who's it for now? For decades, the magazine White Dwarf has served two primary functions. One, as a chronicle of some of the greatest fantasy and sci-fi universes ever created, and two, as the most effective piece of subliminal print-based psychological warfare ever devised against our wallets. This magazine has spent nearly 50 years selling us the dream, and then immediately selling us the 80-piece plastic kit required to build it. And over those 5 decades, it's changed its mind about what it is and who it's for, and more importantly, what it's selling you this month. So today, for historical curiosity, let's have a 50-year retrospective review of the product catalogue known as White Dwarf Magazine. Hello and welcome to The State of Play. I'm Will, and today I thought we could have a look back at how the evolution of the cleverly named White Dwarf magazine helped relieve us of our disposable income over the last 50 years. A White Dwarf referencing both sci-fi and fantasy. Get it? That means today I'm not going to talk about the hobby or Games Workshop or the games themselves. No, today I'm going to talk about the glossy brochure. Now, to track this fascinating and occasionally baffling evolution, there was no way I was going to leaf through every issue. I mean, I can't anyway, I don't own them all. Hundreds and hundreds, yes, but White Dwarf and I had an on-off relationship over the years. Remember White Dwarf Weekly? Who thought that was a good idea? Instead, I decided to perform a centenary sweep, basically diving into the pivotal ego-boosting milestone issues. 50, 100, 200, 300, 400, and the now nearly 2-year-old issue 500. This should let me follow its journey from a humble, slightly grubby fanzine where you could actually buy a cheap blister pack of lead miniatures to the glossy, high-production corporate catalogue that these days costs 10 times more than the metal models it used to feature. Effectively, we could call it a chronological autopsy, a bit of a journey through the changing aesthetic standards, increasingly complex price tags, and the slow, systematic destruction of Dungeons & Dragons content. So not that dissimilar from what Wizards of the Coast have been doing to D&D for a few years. Let's start with issue 50, because I don't own issue 1. Only 75 pence. February 1984. A time when hair was bigger, shoulder pads were optional, and Rolf Harris was still playing with the old stylophone. You know, before he decided to play with younger models. In the 80s, Games Workshop was still, dare I say it, far more innocent. The people who ran the place were hobby nerds who had never heard of a financial spreadsheet, let alone a shareholder. This was a different beast altogether. Less a glossy brochure, more a slightly more polished fanzine. It felt like it was written by enthusiasts for enthusiasts, probably from behind a Dungeon Master screen in a dimly lit back room over lukewarm lager. What do we find in issue 50? Well, a really weird mix, especially if you're used to today's magazine, and it's all wall-to-wall, edge-to-edge text in a font size designed to get the most on a page. This was pre-technology, remember, back when words were worth 1,000 pictures, because it used to cost thousands to print colour pictures. There's articles on RuneQuest, Call of Cthulhu, proper old-school role-playing games. And this was a time when ICE only stood for Iron Crown Enterprises, the company that made Middle-earth roleplay. There are adverts for actual lead miniatures and games that you'd have to order by mail before you even knew what they looked like. Mainly because Games Workshop hadn't conquered every high street at this point. You'd wait patiently for the post so you could unwrap and see for the first time your Citadel Dungeon Monsters starter set for only £3.95 plus 60 pence post and packing. The humour is drier than your grandma's knitting. The artwork is scrappy and amateurish in places, and the layout, well, let's just say it had character. It wasn't trying to sell you a £100 plastic kit every other page. It was selling you ideas. And maybe a Ral Partha designed dragon or a new rulebook. It was quaint, it was charming, it's what your granddad read before the internet arrived and ruined everything by providing online shopping. because that pretty much removed all incentive to convert a goblin raiding party out of a coat hanger and some dried putty. Fast forward 4 years to April 1988 and we arrive at issue 100, now £1.25, and immediately you can feel the shift. The magazine's put on a bit of muscle, it's glossier, more professional, much more colour, and it even came with a free John Blanche poster. The photography is better because, well, it actually has some, and the editors have finally learnt what a paragraph is. The articles themselves are now more focused on Warhammer Fantasy and 40k, which by this point had just recently launched and was really starting to hit its stride. It's also the first time we heard of an as yet untitled car game, which went on to become the brilliant but quite short-lived Dark Future. It's now a lot easier to see what models you're wanting to buy, as the magazine now features pictures of them, both painted and unpainted. No more sitting by the letterbox to open your heavy mystery package filled with toxic lead. Now you can see what toxicity looked like before you ordered. And you can see how they'll look when painted, courtesy of John Blanche in the now regular heavy metal section. This is when White Dwarf started to solidify its identity as the magazine for Games Workshop miniatures game products. There's still some broader RPG content, mainly for Warhammer Fantasy roleplay, but the balance has tipped decisively. The articles are punchier, the heavy metal painting adverts are spreading throughout the pages, and models are showcased with a level of skill most of us could only aspire to after several decades of practice. And a hobby investment to the value of 4 brand new tyres on a second-hand Vauxhall Cavalier. But there's still a uniquely DIY feel to some of it, even though the corporate polish is starting to shine through. It's like your favourite quirky indie band suddenly got a record deal and a decent stylist. You're happy for them, but you also miss the days when they played in the local pub with sawdust on the floor and occasionally forgot the lyrics. Leaping ahead to August 1996, and for only $2.99 you can pick up issue 200. And man, this was an issue. This was, for many, peak White Dwarf. This issue was a behemoth. It was packed with content. The photography was fantastic, and the articles were firing on all cylinders. It's now full colour, every page. You'd be hard-pressed to find a black and white section anywhere at this point. This is the era of Warhammer Fantasy Battle 5th edition, 2nd edition Space Hulk, Necromunda with cardboard terrain, Warhammer Quest, and of 2nd edition 40k really taking off. And the artwork was just phenomenal. Think John Blanche, think Adrian Smith, think all those iconic pieces that still define the aesthetic of the games we play today. White Dwarf at this point wasn't just showing you the hobby, it was immersing you in it. Every page was a feast for the eyes, a source of inspiration and a subtle whisper in your ear saying, you need more plastic, lots more plastic, and also some Flock, 5 empty cereal boxes and some PVA glue. The battle reports were legendary, often featuring epic narratives and stunningly painted armies. The heavy metal team was at its absolute peak, pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible with a paintbrush and a steady hand. There were rules additions, new units, campaign ideas. It was a treasure trove. If you were a Warhammer fan of the 90s, White Dwarf 200 would have been your Bible. It represented a golden age where the balance between hobby content, lore and product adverts felt almost perfectly struck. Almost. They still wanted your money, obviously, but they were very polite about it, offering you a full battle scenario before presenting the invoice. December 2004 brings us to issue 300, now only £4. The turn of the millennium has happened, the internet is pretty much everywhere, and White Dwarf is evolving to keep pace. The magazine's even slicker, even more professional. The articles are shorter, punchier, designed for a slightly faster consumption, probably because by now we have the attention span of Timothée Chalamet listening to opera. This was the era of Lord of the Rings, and the magazine felt as if it was beginning to be split into sections fighting for attention. Over half to bolster a flagging Warhammer Fantasy, under a quarter for 40k, a quarter for Middle-earth, and the rest being news, events and editorial. Like this, to me, was the point where the magazine started to feel less like a community publication and more like a very high-end, very persuasive catalogue. The focus is almost entirely on new releases, painting guides for those new releases, and battle reports featuring, you guessed it, those new releases. What would have been great DIY hobby terrain builds were minimally explained so quick on some pages, but had entire dedicated articles on others. This coastal terrain board build, great, but these warpstone pits, Sacred Lake and Joust Arena, not so much. It seemed pretty obvious the new favourite child was the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game, and Games Workshop was struggling with Warhammer Fantasy Battle. This was the start of a decade-long negative feedback loop for Warhammer Fantasy, where it was slowly dying due to mismanagement, or mismanagement caused the slow dying. Either way, it felt like Games Workshop needed it to grow up and move out, or at least start paying rent and doing its own laundry. The independent RPG content is long gone, relegated to the annals of history, and with it went reasonable prices for most of the plastic kits. The lore is still there, but it's often tied directly into promoting a new army or character. It's efficient, it's effective, but some of that quirky charm of the earlier issues has really started to fade. It was a sign of the times, maybe, as Games Workshop continued its trajectory towards becoming the global miniatures giant it is today. Essentially, the corporate efficiency started to eclipse the hobby eccentricity. April 2013, issue 400, £5.50. Well, by this point, White Dwarf had fully embraced its role as the primary promotional vehicle for Games Workshop. The magazine was almost entirely focused on new releases. The articles were incredibly short, often just a few paragraphs accompanying lavish photos of newly released models. It started to feel a lot like a coffee table catalogue for a high-end furniture brand. Even the layout screamed this. Big pictures of product, small paragraphs of easily skippable text, because, ooh, look at those models that I really need to buy. Now. The battle reports were less about interesting narratives and more about showcasing a new unit's rules and how devastatingly effective they were, surprise surprise, had you just bought enough of the right models. The painting guides were focused on the fastest way to get a new kit onto the tabletop, often featuring techniques that were more about efficiency than artistic expression. The implication was buy it painted in 3 colours and get it on the table before we attempt to sell you the next kit, or the novelty wears off. And for some weird reason they decided to call it paint splatter. Like, what was wrong with heavy metal? Like, I know most models were actually plastic by this point, but splatter doesn't exactly sound like a tidy paint job. Issue 400 became a very different beast. If you wanted deep dives into lore, intricate hobby articles, or anything outside of the latest Games Workshop releases, you were likely looking elsewhere, probably online, which by this point was overflowing with community-created content that was frankly better, and often still is, provided it's not torpedoed by a cease and desist. White Dwarf 400 felt like the logical conclusion of the trajectory set by issue 300, a stunningly produced, highly effective, but ultimately singular-focused product catalogue. It was the magazine equivalent of a shiny, expensive brochure you'd get for a luxury car. Beautiful to look at, but not much substance beyond telling you to buy the car, and maybe suggesting leather trim with yellow stitching? After the catalogue conundrum of the 400s and the very short-lived failure that was the split to White Dwarf Weekly and Warhammer Visions, we enter the modern era, when Games Workshop seemed to have listened, or maybe they simply noticed that people missed having actual content in their content delivery vehicle, so they kinda went back to a slightly more balanced approach. Back in the 80s, White Dwarf was a gritty, independent publication. It was about gaming. You'd find articles on D&D, or maybe a complex non-essential scenario for a game you didn't even own. It was a chaotic, mishmashed, creative resource. The modern White Dwarf, the one that issue 500 now represents, is a monument to corporate production values. It's still glossy, still highly promotional, but they've brought back some of the meat, with notably more articles written by hobbyists on the studio team, giving it back a small measure of that lost personality. You can set up the scenarios, you can play the missions, and you can copy and play what you read again. It's heavy, it's eye-catching, it's meticulously designed to serve 2 primary functions: mandatory product support and unapologetic advertising. It's evolved from a magazine about tabletop hobbying to the holy text of Games Workshop consumerism. The progression's clear. We've gone from here's how to make your own dungeon tiles from cardboard to here is the one true canon colour of the plasma coil on the new £150 plastic behemoth we released last week. It's not just a magazine anymore, it's a small hardback novel attempting to disguise itself as an issue. This one, at 192 pages, serves as a wonderful reminder that digital content might be convenient, but nothing beats the weight of 500 issues of history hitting your mailbox with a dull thud. Or should I say a dull thrud? You older guys will get that one. The big story for the latest centennial issue is naturally the monumental milestone of reaching issue 500 and looking back on the history that I've just glossed over in this video. And of course, Grombrindle, the White Dwarf himself. They've given him a new miniature again, and crucially rules for Age of Sigmar, Underworlds, Warcry, and Cursed City. That's 4 games. The dwarf's a legend, yes, but he also needs to pick a damn hobby. I guess after its 50 years of ups and downs, it now feels like a more mature, confident publication that understands its role to celebrate the hobby, inspire its fanboys, and yes, blatantly and unscrupulously encourage you to buy that stunning new plastic kit you absolutely cannot live without. White Dwarf 500 is a monument to persistence. It's bulky, it's full of rules, it contains just enough history to make you feel old. It's managed to find a successful middle ground, leaning heavily on the aesthetic prowess of issue 200, but with the ruthless efficiency and sales focus of issue 400. It's the best of both worlds, provided you only care about Games Workshop's worlds. So there you go, a whirlwind tour through 5 decades of White Dwarf filtered through my, shall we say, prism of centenary editions. I guess I'd say it went through an evolution that mirrored the hobby itself, from a small shared passion to a global, highly lucrative industry. What it lost in wide-ranging charm, it gained in jaw-dropping production value, even if the vast majority of us are becoming priced out. I imagine most people's favourite era of White Dwarf was the one where they started. I miss the late 80s and 90s where you could be taught to make a fantasy house in one issue and build a tank in another. Now, almost everything has a price tag, and there's very little for those of us who still collect cereal boxes. What about you guys? Do you still have stacks of White Dwarf gathering dust like ancient, slightly flammable relics? Maybe you miss the days of lead miniatures and random missions for long out-of-print games? Let me know in the comments. Thank you to my amazing patrons who keep the lights on and the camera rolling on this channel, and there's no links or sponsors in this video, so nothing to click and buy. Sorry if you wanted to, but even I get annoyed with how much money this hobby costs. However, for further hobby supplies and recommendations, tips and tricks, feel free to visit TheStateofPlay.co.uk. And that's the State of Play for today. I'll see you soon.